About a year ago, I went on a camping trip to the Appalachian Mountains with my boyfriend, Wes, and 3 friends, Brian, Lisa, and Hannah. It was a cold winter weekend, and we were all eager to escape the monotony of daily life for some hiking and stargazing. We pulled into the isolated campsite late Friday night, around 11:30 p.m., with no one else in sight except for a lone RV parked near the entrance and a small tent a bit farther up the road. As we unloaded our gear and set up camp, it felt oddly quiet. Not even the usual chirp of crickets pierced the air. We shrugged it off as a product of the cold season and got to work assembling the tents under the dim light of our headlamps. That's when Lisa whispered, "Hey, do you guys see her?" Standing just at the edge of our lantern light was a woman. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing a thin hoodie and jeans despite the freezing temperature. Her hair hung limp around her face and her eyes. Her eyes didn't seem to focus on any of us as she introduced herself in a flat, almost robotic tone. She said her name was Claire and that she and her boyfriend were camping nearby. She didn't look well. Her face was pale and marked with small, raw patches, like she'd been compulsively scratching. We tried to be polite, but something about her felt off. Then we noticed him. Her boyfriend stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden among the trees, just staring at us. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his posture was unnerving, rigid, like a statue. After a long, silent moment, he turned and walked back toward their campsite. Claire gave us a weak smile and excused herself, following him back. We tried to shake it off as a strange encounter, but not unsettling enough to ruin the trip. We shared jokes about how every camping trip seems to attract characters, and eventually turned in for the night. Wes and I zipped into our tent, cocooned in sleeping bags, ready to finally relax. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, the faint murmur of voices drifted through the still air, Claire and her boyfriend arguing. It started low, but their voices grew louder, angrier. The words became indistinct, replaced by Claire's frantic pleas and his booming shouts. Then a sharp sound cut through the night, glass breaking. Wes shot up, his face pale in the dim glow of our flashlight. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered, my heart pounding. We sat frozen as we heard a car engine roar to life. Tires skidded against gravel, and headlights blazed past our tent, casting long, sharp shadows. The car disappeared down the dirt road, only to return minutes later. It parked roughly, its headlights aimed toward the other couple's tent. That's when we heard the pops. 2 loud, sharp bangs that reverberated through the stillness. Gunshots. I held my breath, gripping Wes's arm. My mind raced, paralyzed by a mix of fear and indecision. We couldn't just sit there, but stepping outside felt unthinkable. From somewhere in the distance, Claire's voice cut through again, crying and frantic, followed by more shouting. Eventually, the yelling faded into silence. I don't know how long we stayed awake, listening for any sound, but by dawn, everything was eerily quiet. When we unzipped our tent, Claire and her boyfriend were gone. Their tent was packed up, the car missing, as if they had never been there. We were making breakfast when the man from the RV approached. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a scruffy beard and a cautious demeanor. After some small talk, he leaned closer, his voice low and serious. "You shouldn't have brought her," he said, nodding toward me. "Not safe for women out here. You never know who's lurking." His words sent a chill through me. I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked away. Needless to say, we didn't stick around to find out what he meant. We packed up quickly and drove to a different section of the park, finding a beautiful spot near a lake. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and for a while, we managed to relax. But the memory of that night clung to me. I kept replaying the argument, the glass breaking and those gunshots. What had we stumbled into? What if we'd intervened? Even now I wonder about Claire, who she was, where she is, and what really happened that night in the woods. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. A few winters ago I needed a break. College life in the city was suffocating, and I craved the kind of solitude that only deep woods can offer. So, against the advice of almost everyone I knew, I planned a solo camping trip to a remote state forest. I'd grown up hiking and camping, and while I wasn't an expert, I was confident enough in my skills to handle a few days in the wild. I drove out early on a Friday morning, leaving the noise and crowds behind. My destination was a remote patch of forest known for its rugged trails and sparse visitors. Perfect. After parking in a small, icy lot at the trailhead, I strapped on my pack, double-checked my compass, and headed into the woods. The air was crisp, the snow crunching under my boots, and after a few hours I found a secluded spot to set up camp. The first night passed peacefully. The silence of the woods felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. By the second day, I was completely immersed in the solitude, hiking through snowy trails and catching glimpses of deer tracks. Late that afternoon, I decided to try my hand at ice fishing on a frozen pond I'd marked on my map. It was only about a mile from camp, and I made it there without any trouble. The pond was serene, surrounded by skeletal trees that seemed to lean in, as if watching me. I cleared a hole in the ice and started fishing. The first catch came quickly, a fat, glistening trout. I was about to clean it when I realized how clumsy I'd become with a knife. Cutting into the fish felt awkward, and in my frustration, I nicked my finger. The sting was sharp, and blood welled up instantly. I cursed under my breath and focused on the task. But something about the stillness around me started to feel wrong. At first it was subtle, a sensation of being watched. Then, just as I dropped the fish into the snow by accident, I heard it. A low, melodic whistle. It was faint, distant, and so unexpected that I froze. My mind immediately conjured images of some friendly hiker signaling their approach. But as I listened, the whistle grew more erratic, dipping and rising in pitch. It didn't sound like a person anymore. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the trees. Nothing. The whistling stopped. I shook off the unease and packed up, deciding to head back to camp. The walk felt longer this time, and the shadows stretched like grasping hands as the sun dipped behind the hills. About halfway back, I noticed something in the distance, a dark shape protruding from the snow. Curiosity got the better of me, and I veered off the path to investigate. What I found froze me in my tracks. A moose carcass, fresh and massive, sprawled across the clearing. Its glassy eyes stared up at the pale sky, and a clean bullet hole pierced its skull. But something about the scene didn't make sense. The animal hadn't been field-dressed. Hunters don't leave meat to spoil, and dragging a moose out of a remote forest seemed like an impossible task. My stomach churned as I realized how unnatural the scene was. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now. I backed away, my breath visible in the frigid air, and hurried toward my camp. Every crack of a branch or rustle of snow made my pulse race. By the time I saw the faint glow of my campsite through the trees, my relief was overwhelming, until I noticed something wrong. My tent had been slashed open, its fabric hanging in jagged ribbons. My heart thundered as I approached, scanning the area for any signs of who or what had done this. My belongings were scattered, and the snow around the site was stained with blood and viscera. The air reeked of iron and decay, and at the center of the chaos lay the moose carcass, now grotesquely butchered and half covered in snow. That was it. I grabbed what little I could carry and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, panting and shaking as I threw my gear into the back seat and sped down the winding forest road. I found a small roadside motel an hour later, where I tried to calm myself with the mindless distraction of late-night TV. But sleep wouldn't come. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. The caller ID was unknown, but I answered anyway. "Miss," a gruff voice said, "this is Ranger Harlan. I found your campsite. You might want to sit down." He went on to describe what he'd found. My shredded tent, the mutilated moose, and drag marks leading away from the site. The ranger sounded uneasy as he added, "Whoever did this, they weren't hunting. They were leaving a message, and I'd guess they were close by when you left." The next morning, I met Ranger Harlan at the trailhead. He drove me back into the woods on an ATV, retracing my steps. The campsite was a nightmare. My tent was beyond repair, and the ranger's face was grim as he examined the scene. The drag marks led deeper into the woods, vanishing into the snow like a trail to nowhere. We left quickly, and I didn't look back. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. Was it a deranged hunter? A predator toying with its prey? All I know is that I'll never camp alone again. Some silences aren't peaceful. They're watching. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. A few years ago, I took a contract job that required me to drive all over California, upgrading shelving at every CVS pharmacy. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and the constant travel kept me busy. 1 month into the gig, I was deep in the middle of nowhere, driving through the redwood forests on a desolate stretch of highway. The kind of place where the trees seem to swallow the sky, and your cell signal might as well not exist. About 40 miles into the drive, I realized I smelled not just post-work tired, but the kind of funk that would make a client instinctively step back when you walked into the room. That's when I spotted a tiny, weathered sign for a campground at the next turnoff. Figuring they might have showers, I took the exit, praying this detour wouldn't set me too far behind. The camp looked like something out of a forgotten horror movie. 15 spots, all tightly clustered in a circle, sat empty except for a few weather-beaten picnic tables and a rusty fire pit or two. It was eerily quiet. No cars, no tents, just me, my truck, and the promise of a quick shower. Perfect. I grabbed a towel, some clean clothes, and headed toward the bathhouse, a squat cinder-block building that looked barely functional. As I approached, I heard the unmistakable sound of running water. My steps faltered. Someone was already in there. The camp was deserted. There wasn't another vehicle in sight. Who the hell would be taking a shower in the middle of winter, in the middle of nowhere? A pot farmer? A wayward hiker? A hermit? My mind spiraled through possibilities as I debated whether to turn back. But I figured the doors were solid metal with heavy bolts. It wasn't like anyone could sneak up on me, right? I picked a stall a few doors down from whoever was already in there. The setup was typical for these places. Coin-operated showers. Very California. I stripped down, dropped my quarters in, and stepped under the stream of hot water. Bliss. For about 5 seconds. The moment my water started, the guy in the other stall let out a guttural scream. My first thought, I'd stolen his hot water. Great. I was suddenly the asshole of the campsite. But then, as I stood there under the water, something began gnawing at the back of my mind. If I'd taken his hot water, why didn't he say anything? Why didn't he curse me out? The screaming had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavy. Wrong. Then came the bang. A thunderous crash reverberated through the stall as someone slammed against my door. I froze. My heart rate skyrocketed as the banging continued, over and over. The sound of flesh and bone meeting metal in furious repetition. "What the hell?" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. No response, just more pounding. I scrambled out of the water, dripping and shivering as I pressed my back against the door, fists raised in case it gave way. Fighting someone in a confined space was one thing, but fighting while stark naked, that was a whole new level of vulnerability. My brain raced through worst-case scenarios. Who was out there? Why were they doing this? If they broke in, would this be a fight to the death? The banging suddenly stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the steady drip of water from the shower head. My breathing was shallow, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. "Hey!" I called out, trying to steady my voice. "I'm sorry, man. I'll give you more quarters if you need them." No response. I waited, each second dragging on like an eternity. Finally, I relaxed enough to believe the guy had come to his senses and walked away. Taking a deep breath, I resumed my shower, trying to scrub away both the dirt and the adrenaline. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave. My thoughts drifted to my truck, parked just outside. It was packed with thousands of dollars worth of tools, my livelihood. What if he wasn't gone? What if he was rifling through my stuff right now? I couldn't shake the thought. I jumped out of the shower, barely managing to yank my pants on before throwing open the stall door and sprinting outside, my bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. As I rounded the corner of the building, my heart thudding in my chest, I braced myself for the worst. But there was nothing. My truck sat undisturbed, the parking lot empty except for the shadows of the towering redwoods. Relief washed over me, followed by a strange cocktail of confusion and anger. Who was this guy? A local with a grudge against trespassers? A hermit? A lunatic? I wasn't sticking around to find out. I threw my damp clothes into the truck, started the engine, and peeled out of that camp like my life depended on it. As I drove away, the chill of the air conditioning did little to calm my nerves. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure sprinting after me down the road. But there was nothing, just the endless trees and the fading light. I don't know who or what I encountered that day. But one thing's for sure, I'm never stopping at an empty campsite in the middle of nowhere again. Dear wilderness shower ghost or redwood psycho, please, just let me shower in peace.